Hello, my name is Al Kraft. I'm a non-resident friend of the Upper St. John River Valley. I came here originally after I got out of the service in the 70s, and at the time, as all of you recall, the country was in turmoil. And as it turns out, I needed Fort Kent a lot more than Fort Kent needed me. But after 4 years at university, I graduated with a useful degree and a great education and went off to make my living. In doing so, I left the valley, but the valley never really left me. In that, after 30 years of wandering the globe, quite literally, for one of the national security services here in the US, I had the good fortune of a great retirement and the chance to come back here. And I have come back here virtually every fall for the last decade at least. A couple of years ago, I had the good fortune on a whim to come here to Tardiff Sawmill in pursuit of a hobby that I had developed over the years, and that was digital photography. I knocked on the door. Dan Tardiff invited me in, and I took a number of photos. And that started an interest on my part in not just this mill, but in mills all throughout the Upper St. John River Valley. In the early pursuit of my curiosity, I ran across a 2-volume encyclopedia produced by Joseph Theriault, which is an exhaustive and meticulous work that I would recommend to anyone who's interested in mills. In that work, he itemized every one of the grain mills and sawmills that were built here after the Acadians first arrived in 1785. There are more than 350 of them on both sides of the river, from the confluence of the St. Francis all the way down to Grand Falls. And in the course of looking through all that material, I realized that this is the last mill. Out of that 350, Tardiff Sawmill, now a little over 100 years old, is the last mill standing. And the fact that it's here, it operates, and produces a viable income for a family-owned business, it really is the quintessential heritage enterprise. And the fact that it continues to operate, to function, to be profitable, and an economically rational undertaking, my curiosity in the history of mills in the valley blossomed. And so in researching this mill and discovering Mr. Theriault's work, I embarked on a course of study of all the mills in the valley. Now, in doing that, my interest wasn't to duplicate what Mr. Theriault had done. If I'd done that, one of us would have been unnecessary, right? But I thought about the mills in a different way, in the same way that in the night you can see thousands and millions, billions of stars. You can't study every one, but you can study constellations, the Big Dipper, the Belt of Orion. So I clustered what I was doing according to the kinds of mills I found. And there were lumber mills and there were grist mills. Some mills did the carding of wool. Others more like factories and mills, produced starch. But the ones that tended to survive over the long haul were the mills that prospered by integrating what they did across products from the forest and products from fields. So it was lumber mills tended not to last very long, and grist mills tended not to last very long, sometimes a generation or two. But the ones that survived the longest were the ones that did both. Hybrid mills, a sawmill that also had a grindstone in it. All of which told me that, in a place like this, isolation, hardship of severe weather, It was necessary for communities to have mills early on. It was a matter of not just survival, but of community. When the early mills came, they came not just to produce a product, be it flour or beams. They were a gathering place. They were a magnet, not just for commerce, but more importantly for culture. And so, in the end, I've pulled together what I call a graphic essay that tells the story of these mills in 11 small chapters. And it's as I say, graphics rich, maps, photos, charts, tables, and some narration. All of that is culminated in an installation which is at UMFK at the Blake Library now. So I invite anyone who has got some abiding interest in the region or in mills in particular to come by and take a look. Well, welcome to the photos at the exhibition, as it were. Many of you know Don Raymond, who's doing the videography today. He and I drove over here from Tardiff Mill to have this encounter. And along the way, I was reminded that in 1976, when I first came to Fort Kent, I used to jog a circuit, and that would take me from the university up Pleasant Street, across the old Dickey Bridge, past Tardiff Mill, and then around Market Street in a big loop. I couldn't do that today because I'm, a little more prosperous than I used to be. In any event, it was those recollections that triggered my interest in going into the Tardiff Mill a couple years ago to take photos. So that was the genesis of all of this. In the course of my study, I wanted to start with just a simple overlay of how many mills are there and where are they on both sides of the river. And so I mapped them out on a notional little map here, and 350 dots, one per, and there's quite a number. We learned that most of the simple majority were, over the course of time, on the Canada side, a slightly less than half on the American side. But they took advantage of a variety of things to include the geography of the St. John River, of course, which is it drains about 22,000 miles, 14,000 of which are on the Canada side, the remainder on the Maine side. And it is that river basin that forms two things bounteous to the St. John River Valley. That is, the river itself was for so long the only transportation mode. And because it was the only transportation mode and it flowed in one direction, the area was very isolated, highly isolated. And it's in that isolation and the lack of access to market that so much of the story is told. It's important because the mills, number one, were centers of gravity in the community, and they produced the consumable grain, flour, and the wood products needed for shelter. So food, clothing, shelter, it all had to be made on hand, in place. No falling back on supermarkets or markets of any sort. If you wanted leather, you had to make it. If you wanted lumber, you had to cut it. If you wanted bread, you had to bake it. And so over the course of the years, as we can see by this little chart, mills came, they opened, they flourished, and they closed. The natural life cycle of anything, really. But the heyday of milling, saw and grist, was in the late part of the 1900s, the early part of first decade of the 2000s, 1900s. In any event, this is the first of 11 chapters. There are many more where this came from, and we'll walk you through generally what those look like. Because mills are quintessentially a human enterprise, 3 of the chapters in this graphic essay relate to the peoples who occupied the upper St. John River Valley. And I felt it would be shameful not to start with the Native Americans who were here before the French or the English came. And so there's a module, a chapter, on the Indians who lived here prior to the European arrival. The people who lived here were a tribe who referred to themselves as the Wolustageek. They were one of 5 Wabanaki tribes in the Algonquin Nation. Another Wabanaki tribe, mostly consolidated on the coast of what is now New Brunswick, had a pejorative name for their sister tribe, which the English and the French both corrupted into the word Malecite. So they came to be known in the European community as Malecite Indians, but they were the Wolustageek. The area that they lived in fanned all the way south from the Côte d'Azur, the southern coast of the St. Lawrence, down about to the point where the Acadians eventually established a town called St. Anne's. In the area of St. Anne's, the Native Americans had for a long period of time cultivated land on the margins of the St. John River in what they called, what the Europeans called, intervales, basically the floodplain. And a lot of the Acadian capacity to produce food for themselves came as a consequence of contact with the Indians, and they learned some of their tricks of the trade. They managed microclimates quite well and were able to grow corn, squash, beans, the big 3. Certainly down in that part of what would become New Brunswick. But mills being the theme here, it was, I thought, a useful thing to investigate what did they do with forest products in the way that we would have harvested wood. What did they do with the products of their fields in terms of preparing them for consumption? We know that they grew corn, they processed it, they ground it, they stored it underground, and would carry it in cornmeal in sachets on their belts. How do you get cornmeal? You grind it. How do you grind it? Good question. It's a good question largely because there are no physical artifacts that demonstrate that the Malecite used any kind of mortar or pestle. But we do know from lexicons that were passed down by Harvard researchers that they had words in their language for stone mortar and stone pestle. So yes, indeed, they treated their products of the field in much the same way as the Europeans would later on. Smaller scale, same thing. They also employed a lot of the wood products that they could harvest from the forest to produce manners of transportation, be that canoes or wigwams. And in the course of, for example, canoe building, they used cedar staves, birch bark for the hull of a canoe, balsam pitch and tar for the purposes of waterproofing it. And so they did use a great deal of the products available to them from the forest in the same way that Europeans would later on. A little sort of fact on the side, birch bark was exceptionally beneficial for the Indians because the bark grows around the bole of the tree, unlike most other barks which grow vertically from the rootstock up towards the crown of the tree. And so in this way they could carve off sheets and have the use of those sheets for whatever purpose they wanted to use it for. They had 6 different words for birch bark, according to the season in which it was harvested and its suppleness. So their attachment to the land was very real and for them, very concrete. Again, the archaeological record is meager with respect to the Maliseet, but they left behind a lot of words that we use today. Tamarack, Gaspé, caribou, Allagash, all of these are words from their language. And the key one that I would sort of point us to is Wolustaqiq. If you're an English or a French pioneer and you hear the word Wolustaqiq, you could hear it through uncertain ears and in turn garble it yourself. And if you garble it enough, Wolustaqiq becomes a Roostaqiq, becomes a Roostic. So a Roostic is essentially their word for this place. It's quite a remarkable story, not directly attached to mills, but still one that's quite enjoyable. One of the most sweet words that I found out of the Maliseet lexicon is the word that they used to name the place where they lived, which they called the Land of Plenty. In Maliseet, Land of Plenty is Acadie. And you can well imagine that the French people, who were allies with the Indians long before the expulsions, and certainly during and long after the expulsions, turned also to the same word to refer to their land of plenty as Acadia. With that, we'll turn to Frenchmen. The French experience in the Upper St. John River Valley began really with 2 threads of inflows. The first, popularly well known, of course, is the Acadian inflow. But it was almost contemporary with a flow of French-speaking Catholic immigrants leaving Quebec, and coming down into the valley, contemporaneous with the Acadian flow. So we know that much of this is triggered by the consequences of the American Revolutionary War. Out of that, loyalist colonists who had been on the British side and living in the colonies felt it necessary to get out of Dodge. And they ended up going into the British colonies, still held in what would become Canada, essentially Nova Scotia. After the period of expulsions, much of that concentration of Acadians was in and around the area of St. Anne and Fredericton. They felt pressed upon, and they elected, as best they could, to want to relocate well north and into the Upper St. John Valley. Why? Because there was no reach of government there. They wanted to be out from underneath it. In the process, they ended up basically splitting the difference between Fredericton, geographic difference between Fredericton and Quebec, and that's where the valley is. Those 2 important nodes in the British colonial empire, Fredericton and Quebec, were connected overland and by river system, so that they could have an avenue of dialogue and commerce year-round. Typically, during the spring and summer, they would have had connectivity laterally by sea through the St. Lawrence. But in the winter, the St. Lawrence froze. And so it was critically important for the colonial administrators in Fredericton, Halifax, and in Quebec to have this overland route. And it was referred to as the postal route. So about halfway between these nodes was the place called Madawaska, which was at the time an Indian village, Maliseet village, of about 1,000 souls. one of the adventurous French Canadians who wanted to trade with the Indians, Mr. Pierre Dupré, as Mr. Raymond would correct my French, set up a trading post there in the late 1780s, early 1780s. He befriended Louis Mercure, an Acadian, and Mercure had been a second generation messenger between Fredericton and Quebec for the colonial administrators. He was well known to them. And Dupré and Mercure decided that they would petition the administrators for land grants in the area of Madawaska. The administrators were a bit torn, but not for long. They were torn in that they knew that the land through which the postal route threaded had been conveyed by King George to the Americans in the Treaty of Paris, 1783. And they wanted to claw that territory back because of the criticality of that route. So in the convenience of the administrators, they approved the granting of land to French-speaking Catholic, Acadian, and Quebec petitioners to grant them rights to land that wasn't theirs to grant, to establish facts on the ground, to give ballast to an argument that the treaty was really written in error, and it wasn't the king's intention to convey all that land to the Americas. So the French settlements in the Upper St. John River Valley was predicated on America's first big lie. That was that the Treaty of Paris was flawed. It certainly was not, I will argue elsewhere in this essay. But they came. And who came? Initially, among the many families who petitioned to come from traditional Acadia were the Thibodeaux. Thibodeaux were an expert milling family who had arrived in the New World with their guildsman credentials fully vetted as grist mill operators. They could build them and they could operate them. And in the course of the first 25 years of French-speaking settlement in Upper St. John River Valley, 5 mills were established. They were all grist mills, one of which was owned by Mr. Thibodeau. He took it upon himself to not just have a gristing operation in his mill, but he also included a saw. So his was not only one of the first 5 grist mills, it was the first hybrid mill to include both serviceable functions under one roof. In any event, over the course of time, the Indian nation that was at Madawaska was swept up into the quest for land. And along with settlers, they petitioned the government in Fredericton for land grants to their own land, and they were denied. With that, we'll turn to the arrival of the English-speaking Protestants. The arrival of English-speaking Protestants came early in the 19th century, 1814, 15, 16-ish. And they came in a number of waves, triggered by war. In the same way that the indirect consequences of the American Revolutionary War displaced loyalists who displaced Acadians who came to the valley, the War of 1812 was a trigger for Anglo arrivals, and it goes something like this. Because of the War of 1812, the American Treasury was relatively bankrupt. Because it was relatively bankrupt, the government didn't want to get confrontational with the British over their argument that the border was misdrawn by the Treaty of 1783. So after the War of 1812 and America's and Washington, D.C.'s anemic response, patriotic, jingoistic Americans in southern Maine decided that they would take action. And the action they were going to take was to move north through Aroostook and across the St. John River into what is now parts of New Brunswick. And these guys, the Kennebec men, included names well known to most Northern Mainers. Baker, Wheelock, Savage, Maddox, and others. So they came, and where the French had established their presence from Madawaska south towards Grand Falls, these Kennebec men went to the river and established themselves upstream of there in what would become later known as, colloquially, the American settlement. So they came, and in a similar wave out of other parts of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, Scotsmen and Irishmen felt themselves pressed by the prejudice of the expatriate ex-American loyalists, and felt that they, like the Acadians, needed to leave. And when they did, they came to the upper St. John River Valley and settled into a place we now know as Allagash. So those two minor waves, the Kennebec men and Allagashers, were a direct product of war. Part of the problem set up by uncertainty about the fake uncertainty about the border, however, was that there were vast amounts of virgin forest land that was untapped in Aroostook that could be, if harvested, moved to market by the south-flowing rivers, the Aroostook and the St. John. And so this set up a dynamic of what was then called timber trespass, where raiders from essentially New Brunswick would come across and service forests, felling trees, and moving it by the river system down to the coastal mills in Fredericton and St. John. Now, they had a odd advantage in their effort, and the odd advantage was that the river was part of the old postal route system, right? So that postal route system was a developed line of communication and commerce. So they could set up their supply networks for these depredations on the New Brunswick side of the river and move goods and services into and out to facilitate their timber hijacking. Americans couldn't quite do the same thing because they had no transportation network. They were in perfect isolation. So in many ways, it could be argued that the Acadians, the Frenchmen, were settlers. Why? Because they had fallback to kin, networks, and markets in Fredericton or Quebec, whereas the Kennebec men were 300 miles from anything related to a support network or markets. So they were more pioneers, as it were. In any event, because of the tension that erupted over the depredation of these lands, eventually Augusta grew more earnest, and they sent forces north to participate in what would become a relatively benign, bloodless Aroostook War. And it was bloodless because even the authorities in New Brunswick grew concerned when one of the principal raids out of New Brunswick and into the northern parts of Aroostook County were triggered by New Brunswick men who got their weaponry and their munitions by raiding a government armory in New Brunswick, and that frightened Fredericton. It frightened them into deciding that ultimately they were going to put the hammer down on this depredations problem. Along with that, then, there came eventually beyond these timberjackers, many of them stayed. But also many of the militiamen who came stayed. And as the border got fixed by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, it became abundantly clear to people in power centers in Maine, Bangor and Augusta, that there was a lot of timber up there. And so there became a coursing of interaction between southern Maine and northern Maine along some of these military roads that were established. Commerce came in, general store operators came in, and big landowners came in and kind of ruled the roost. There's one small anecdote that goes along with all of this. As the southern Mainers came north with their long history of established competencies in forest work and in establishing and running sawmills, there was an effort on the part of the state of Maine to promote settlement in the north, and part of that involved the trade of land for producing, building, and operating mills, sawmills and grist mills. It was a big flop, and there's a particular reason for that. 1798, William Bingham, a rich banker out of Philadelphia, had the opportunity to purchase land in Maine, and he bought two tracts of land, each one of 1 million acres. So Mr. Bingham suddenly owned, personally himself, 2 million acres of Maine. And he didn't want any of this settlement stuff. He didn't want mills in there. And so this great big administrative barrier might as well have been the Rocky Mountains, because it impeded flows between coastal Maine and northern Maine. And what did that do further? It further isolated the north. A small historical footnote in that regard. Mr. Bingham's son-in-law was the Ashburton of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. So Mr. Ashburton came in with a certain angle of attack when he came to his negotiations with Mr. Webster. In any event, this sets up then now a circumstance where Frenchmen in the valley tend to be the best millers of grain, and Anglos in the valley tend to be the premier millers of wood. And that then becomes part of the dynamic that leads us to the next chapter. So after the border was settled in 1842, the next 20 years tended to be a period of sorting out. And it was economic sorting out, it was geographic sorting out, a whole array of things that were once one thing needing to become another. Hence, in this particular chapter, I've titled what we're looking at fusion. The act of two things coming together. And we've learned in some of the earlier parts of the presentation, that mills tended to survive more when they hybridized and they took under one roof the idea of grinding grain or agricultural product and also being a sawmill. And in part I draw this from looking at the 20 mills that were established in the 70 years between 1785 and 1855. There are 20 mills established, 10 went bust, 10 survived. Almost all of the ones that went bust were single product mills, grist or lumber. Of the 10 that did survive, 8 of them were a combination of gristing and sawing. So it was a fusion of these enterprises that enabled them to survive. So the idea here is that there was insufficient economic purpose or viability to survive on products of the field alone. And the same to be said for surviving on the product of forests alone. It was combining them. Now, a number of other kinds of things also went through this fusion process. Most of them generated by ideas of the wealthy trying to exploit the have-nots, the settlers. So now we're starting to see that many of the people who came to this valley, be they Frenchmen or be they English speakers, came for the purposes to live on this land. At the same time, there was a dynamic now underway with the boundary settled and the certainty of land ownership fixed and demonstrable through deed and avenues of recourse if you had a complaint through court systems. The powerful and the wealthy wanted a big part of the pie. Even if they didn't live here, they wanted to live off the land. So we have this dynamic now of those who I call onlanders, settlers to live on the land, and offlanders, exploiters, scavengers who came to live off the land. In the course of that, one dynamic that occurred was that farmers became foresters. They would work their farms in the spring and the summer and then hire themselves out as wage earners during the winter in lumber camps. It worked for a long time, but it became kind of a bondage process whereby rarely were they actually paid in cash because there wasn't much cash in the county at the time. They were paid in IOUs and chits. Now, the true fairness, they could use those chits to buy things in stores as long as they had an accommodating merchant who would help them. And there were plenty of accommodating merchants to help them. Why? Largely because, as a matter of course, they made a lot more on their product through the IOU chit system than they would have any other way. There's a lot to be said about farms being viable in the county and in the Upper St. John River Valley for a long time, because after all, they could take their surplus and sell it to the lumbering enterprises. Well, that's well and good, but they couldn't produce nearly enough. And the lumbering enterprises, not wanting to be vulnerable to failure to supply their workers with food and shelter, developed for themselves the art of being farmers. So suddenly the great big foresters became farmers. And they established depot farms. So one of the more famous ones is the Chamberlain Depot Farm. But they would go to isolated places, carve out an agricultural space of typically some substantial area, and produce their own hay and oats. They would grow whatever they needed to supply their operations deep in the forest, and they would do it from deep in the forest. So these depot farms were an occasion where the foresters became farmers. After a time, with south-flowing rivers out of the Penobscot and the Kennebec, lumbering operations had moved north, up those river basins to the point of near exhaustion of supply, almost wiped out white pine. But what they didn't tap into was the upper part of the Allagash River system, itself a tributary to the St. John. So they were left with a problem. They could either close the mills in Orono and Old Town and rebuild them in the Allagash River Basin, produce their raw product there, and float it down the river system to the sea down the St. John. Or they could just change the course of the rivers. And they elected to do that. And by doing that, they were able to cut a notch that took advantage of dams they built in the headwaters of the Allagash to back up water to a point where, with just a little bit of work, they could scrape a sluiceway that enabled them to reverse the flow of the Allagash River south into Penobscot. That meant they could go up into the Allagash virgin forests, cut their wood, and float it downstream to the mills in Bangor and Old Town. Now, so extreme was this that for a time in the 1850s, the cost of pine in Bangor was exceedingly high in contrast to the cost of pine in Fredericton and St. John. Fredericton and St. John had the advantage of being at the gateway to the sea at the end of the St. John River Valley system. So it received wood that was cut by Americans on the American part of northern Maine and by Canadians in the upper reaches of the St. Francis and the Madawaska rivers. And so the cost of pine was cheaper and more abundant. So extreme was the price delta that Stephen Booty in the upper reaches of the Aroostook River cut wood, floated it down to a critical point, and then carried it over the river divide into the north extreme part of the Penobscot, and was able to take his relatively cheap pine and sell it at a premium price in Bangor. Excuse me. So the other ultimate consequence of all of this mangled together was we had mills got hybridized, river systems got hybridized, farmers became foresters, foresters became farmers, and the Treaty of Webster-Ashburton had been advantageous to the prospect of moving lumber by way of relieving tariffs, because two nations, Canada and the US, were using the same river transport system to get their product to the sea. The Americans who did that up in northern Maine suddenly had their product on Canadian soil, and the only way they could repatriate it was across the border along the coast. That could have been by schooner or rail. But they had to pay a tariff, and they felt that unfair. And the mechanism to cure that complaint was to remove the tariffs. When you remove the tariffs, excuse me, suddenly what had been two nations and two systems of taxes and fees and customs and titles and such became one. So they took and changed what had been two entirely different sovereign regions, and they made it into a single lumber nation. And that set up problems that would cascade into the 70s and 80s, as we'll see in the next chapter. So as things sorted themselves out in the latter half of the 19th century, certain degrees of chaos flowed in. Bear in mind that the county was still greatly isolated with what I call a steel noose around it. The railroad history of Maine is full of mismanagement and bad judgment, much of which was propagated by Alfred Poor, who was kind of the mastermind of rail networks in Maine. He had a vision that was partly materialized. His vision was that Portland would become the great trading center of North America. And his logic held that it was the western or the easternmost port, and thus closest to the trading centers in Europe. And if there could just be a way to train, bad choice of words, but to to sculpt the North American railroad network so that it converged on Portland, it would become the center of the rail and sea trade universe. This was part of what also tempted him into thinking through the Europe and North American rail system, which wanted to take advantage of the distance between New York and Portland. If you traveled that distance by train, you could go much, much faster than by vessel, by ship. Conversely, if you wanted to go by ship from New York to England, you spent a lot of time in transit. And you could shorten the transit for a transatlantic journey by doing a large part of it by rail, right? So Portland and points beyond, all the way over towards Nova Scotia, was part of his vision. To complete that kind of a proposition of making Portland the center of the railroad universe in North America, he had to contend, however, with the idea that the maritime provinces needed a piece of the pie. And to that end, the maritime provinces would have linked up with his vision in southern Maine. The problem was that there was still huge residual animus between Canada and the US as a function of the fake scheme to change the boundary after 1783. That had long echo effect. And so Canada decided that it did not want to have its important lifeline between the Maritimes and Quebec to go through Maine. They wanted it to go around Maine, so they had sovereign control of it. In other words, they wanted the rail system to ride along the same course that had previously been the postal route, way back in the 18th century. And they did. As a consequence, Quebec still, however, needed access to the sea in the winter. And so the deal with railroad authorities in Canada and Mr. Poor was that the Canadians would build a rail network that plunged straight south, more or less, out of Quebec to Portland to give them wintertime access to the sea. And so the net effect of all of that was to build a giant steel noose around Northern Maine, but not into it. So here we have a highly productive natural resource space, completely surrounded by transportation systems, none of which penetrated the space, because rail notwithstanding, they still use river transportation. So there's a great deal of isolation, as it were. In the valley, in the years between 1785, early settlement, and 1900, basically 180 mills had been built, started, run, operated, sometimes transferred generation to generation. By 1900, 58 were still open. And it became more and more apparent as I sort of tried to explain to myself or figure out why they came into being and then busted. There's lots of reasons. Poor choices, bad management, fires destroyed mills, unwise business decisions, lack of wood, too much wood, lack of grain, not enough grain, too much grain. And so the mill operators began to sort themselves out into more than just lumber, grist, or lumber and grist. Some made shingles, some did gristing and wool carding on the side, and they began to have these sort of subspecialties. And as they did so, the longevity of any given mill sort of played out according to the kind of products that they took in and the retail products that they pushed back out. All the while being in a state of deep and near total isolation, the county had literally no currency. No currency. Well, it did have one thing that was powerful, and it's a simple thing, and that was shingles. State lands were abundant. Eastern white cedar was all over the place. And one man with a ferro and a hand slicer could fell a cedar tree and produce shingles by hand. Some of them were basically machines, these men. They could make 1,000 or more, 2,000 or 3,000 shingles in a given day, all by hand. And the quality of what they produced was the charming effect of what kept northern rustic stable for a long time. The rustic shingles became enormously popular in Boston. They were produced in bundles, and because they're thick on one end and thin on the other, they had to be packaged in an interleafed way, which ultimately became known as weaving. So they would weave the shingles into bundles, and they could put them on floating boats, and send them down the river to market. So it's a one-way transit system. The shingles were popular in Boston because they were pliable. They could tack them onto an uneven wall surface, and they would bend and weave with the flaw in the wall and not break. The price was very stable in Boston. Demand was constant and the price steady. As a consequence, shingles in Aroostook County, handmade, became a known commodity of a specified knowable value. And so they could use shingles in a barter economy to buy milk or bread or nails or shoes, you name it. And brokers would take these transferred shingle properties, transferred in small units for use in purchasing items for a household, and put them into consignments, large-scale consignments. People paid their taxes with shingles, and oftentimes they used them as the way to settle debts and to operate as economic actors where there was no currency. The absence of currency has lingered for a long time, but by this point in the valley, the real big landowners, the power money, the power brokers, established their enterprises in New Brunswick and took product by sea into the British Empire, where they didn't have to pay tariff. That was the big deal. If they were an American concern marketing in the British Empire, they would. So they established themselves on the Canada side, New Brunswick, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and they had their resource extraction business in Maine. That means they had to satisfy, they sold their product in denominated pounds, but they had to settle their obligations in Maine in dollars, and they didn't have any. So they invented them, and they created script. So J&P, one of the big companies that followed this business model, floated lots and lots and lots of script that looked like money, same size, $2 denomination, $5 denomination, and they were backed by deposits in banks in Boston and in Canada, until they weren't. There was a panic, global economic panic in the 1870s. J&P was heavily invested in this Alfred Poor fanciful idea of the European North American Railroad, and it went bust. The banks called in the bond obligations on that company. They couldn't satisfy them, and it all went away. Just melted overnight. So everyone in Northern Maine who was relying on this stuff to undertake normal everyday transactions was all wasted, all gone, vaporized in value overnight. Terrible tumult. In any event, this went on pretty well, apart from the J&P bust. until such time as more offlanders realized that there was great value in the production of shingles. Most households up and down the valley, whether that be in the American settlement or south of Madawaska, Frenchville, all the way down to Grand Falls, most homes occupied by non-landowners were shingle makers by hand. And the value of these things was so alluring to big shots in Bangor and Boston that they came up and established, you guessed it, shingle factories, shingle mills. The shingle mills abundantly produced lots of shingles, cratered the value, destroyed the barter economy, and left the onlanders upset, isolated, and resentful. And where there had been a system of an economy that worked on trust between the haves and the have-not, disappeared. So now there was no reconciling this sort of separation of the big shots from the little guys, the offlanders from the onlanders. One of the few things, I'll close with this, one of the few things that kept lumber mills and grist mills going was that rather than large-scale operators who came and went, the small operators, the ones who were focused on community, family, local inputs and local outputs, engaged themselves in the era of the barter economy in what they called toll grinding and custom sawing. These are euphemisms for, you bring me logs, I'll turn it into lumber, and I'll give you most of all the lumber, but take some for myself. And I'll use that for my own economic purposes. Same with gristing. You bring me wheat, I'll give you flour, but I'm going to take a toll on the finished product and use that in my own enterprise to make my own living. And so it was this community process of barter that enabled attachment to forests and fields to produce a local product for local consumption and help to galvanize, would maybe be too strong a word, but to produce a sense of cohesion in the community and its own attachment to the land. We'll see how that got disrupted even further as we turn into the 19th century. That's in the next chapter. So in the years between 1873, 5-ish, and the end of the Depression, havoc ensued. And it came in various forms, but there were four big transformational events that came almost heel to toe. Sometimes they overlapped, sometimes they were discrete. But I'd like to walk you through what those four explosive events were, because they had a profound effect on everything, absolutely everything. So in the early 70s, a couple of gentlemen from New Hampshire came to Northern Maine, exploratory in part. Some folklore says they came to after having attended a funeral where they met a man from Aroostook County, but nonetheless they came up for the purposes of inquiring about the availability of potatoes in abundance, specifically for the purpose of producing starch. Starch was critical, and I get to, industrially speaking, and I'll get to that towards the end of this segment. But the point being that entrepreneurs came to northern Aroostook County specifically in search of potatoes, and they found them, but not in abundance. So to stimulate the production of potatoes, they entered into a form of contract farming in Fort Fairfield, Caribou, and eventually Presque Isle. And the form of contract farming went like this. Dear farmer, I will give you 25 cents a bushel. for every bushel of potatoes you can grow on a number of acres that we will agree upon. So a farmer would say, okay, I'm going to do 5 acres. And the entrepreneur would say, okay, everything you grow on those 5 acres is mine for a period of 5 years. And the farmer goes, oh, okay, but I need some starter money. So here's your starter money. Now at the time, farmers said it costs about 8 cents a bushel for them to plant, farm, harvest, and deliver to the loading dock at a starch factory. That's 17 cents a bushel profit. For a farmer who had never seen $17, suddenly a man who could produce 200 or more bushels of potatoes on an acre for 5 acres was loaded with dough, flush with money the likes of which he had never before seen. There was a problem. Of course, there's always a problem. The problem was that the starch factories produced great volumes of starch, and they had to move it, they had to ship it. There wasn't any means for that. However, as we have learned, along the eastern line of the state, between the sea and up around Grand Falls to Termescata and over to the St. Lawrence and beyond, there was a railroad network. Tapping into it became the key. How do you tap into it? The answer is you build a railroad. Tiny little railroad, narrow gauge. Well, how do you do that? The answer is you use your starch money to build your little railroad network. And suddenly now, you have not just a starch product that produced cash in relative abundance for every farmer willing to bend his back to do it. You had a network of rail, nascent and fragile and small and tiny, but a network of rail. So the combination, first starch, then tiny rail, paid for by the starch, began to crack open the market access for northern Aroostook and the St. John Valley. A couple of more problems. Producing a lot of potatoes means you got to move a lot of potatoes, and there weren't conveyances designed for that at the time. So farmers would pick them up in an apron or a basket or a bag, throw them in a wagon, and they'd haul the wagon to the starch factory, where they had to be paid. And so rather than being paid directly in bushels by volume, they agreed that conventionally by weight, a bushel equaled 60 pounds. So they would pull their cart in to a starch factory where the wagon would be now loaded, would be weighed and noted. Then by hand, the potatoes were cast out and the wagon emptied. They would reweigh the wagon, and the difference in pounds is what they got in these conventional units. Good for the farmer who got there first, bad for the farmer who got there last, because there would be enormously long traffic jams, long lines, 20 and 30 hours at a pace. And so it became horribly inefficient. Well, how do you cure that? A black-hearted journalist back in the day recounted a story, which is partly apocryphal and probably partly true, that a man by the name of T.H. Fair, P-H-A-I-R, a resident of the eastern Aroostook County, in the Presque Isle, Caribou area, decided that one day, as he walked around a general store, that there were vast numbers of empty flour barrels. He decided that he was going to shift his unit of conventional measure from a bushel to a barrel being equal to 2 3/4 bushels. So now he obliged those farmers in a contract to harvest their potatoes, put them in barrels, bring the barrels, deliver the barrels. It's easier to unload 12 barrels and 1,200 pounds of, or 1,400 pounds of potatoes, one by one. And that took care of the traffic jam problem. Another problem sort of ensued from that, however, and that is barrel of potatoes are pretty heavy. So rather than continue to operate with conventional wagons that had the bed of the wagon at about waist height, they invented farmers, smart guys all, and practically minded, developed a drop axle that basically brought the bed of the wagon down to not to waist height, but to shin height. And so lifting up and toting off barrels became facilitated by this clever invention, which became known as the jigger wagon, or sometimes known as a Tabor wagon, Tabor being for the man who's credited with having come up with it. So now you've got starch factories, potato farmers producing starch factories, buying everything they could buy, producing 700-pound hogsheads of starch, and delivering them by horse-drawn teams across the border to the rail network on the New Brunswick side, and they couldn't stand it any longer. Why? Because largely their market was in Lewiston and south in the cotton factories, cotton cloth factories. So everyone had it in their mind that they were going to fix this with rail. They did, and in the course of that, farmers began to clear fields, change the crops they grew, change the animals that they herded, and the whole landscape of Aroostook County and the Upper St. John Valley changed, driven by this preoccupation with the primacy of potatoes. As the production of potatoes advanced, they outgrew the capacity of the starch factories to take in potatoes. So there was a surplus. And the high quality surplus ended up becoming table stock. That table stock had to move to market too, and the tiny rail wasn't sufficient. So the urgency mounted to finally bring big rail into northern Aroostook County, which did over the course of time. When it came almost simultaneous with another transformative disruption, and that was the advent of producing paper using pulp, wood pulp. So big rail and pulp kind of hit the county like Muhammad Ali with the left and the right, boom, all at once. And that booming effect resonated. We have the agricultural landscape in complete transformation, woodland being chopped, sawyers, sawmills experiencing a great boom, producing lumber for new homes and potato houses and warehouses and stores and all the rest, schools and all the rest of it. So as farmers cleared more land, they also went about the business of reducing their herds, fewer cattle, fewer sheep. As a consequence, less hay, less oats. The land thereby liberated more potatoes. It became a virtuous cycle. More potatoes, more money. More money, more land. More land, more potatoes. And it spiraled on and on. Because they were managing fewer cattle, dairy herds, almost no sheep now, because they could get what they needed otherwise. Fewer chickens, less butter, creameries, dairies closed, and the rail was able to bring in meat from the Midwest, from Armour and Swift, flour from the Midwest that was far better in quality and nutrition than what could be grown here. And as I say, the poor grist mills began to wither, and they fell out of the economy because there wasn't enough input or demand on the back end. Pulp, however, king pulp, was the crusher, was the killer. As the rail moved finally north, penetrating to Van Buren, and as the capacity to use what had been marginal wood, not for fabricating boxes or houses, became useful for production of paper, the whole idea of river log drives on the St. John all the way down to the sea at the Bay of Fundy just completely evaporated. And those mills went belly up very, very quickly. Pulp became the thing, and everything changed. Now, what's the big deal about starch? Well, there's two sides to this. Starch is potato starch is kind of a gluey thing, and in the mid part of the 1900s, all the way up into World War I, potato starch was the bee's knees. It was because it was used in two critically important industrial processes. The first of those processes was the production of cotton cloth. And the way this works is when you spin cotton fiber to produce a thread, it has any number of little shards of thread that come off of it. They're ill-behaved. They don't line up necessarily precisely with the thread. If you then use those threads in the warp of cloth, where you're using a high-speed process of a shuttle going back and forth, those tiny little microscopic threads will force the shuttle to jam. It's highly inefficient. Well, how do you cure that? And the answer is you take the thread that will become the warp, and you soak it in a mild solution of potato starch. And what that does is to streamline each thread and make those little errant microscopic hairs behave. And they align perfectly with the thread. You set up your loom, and the shuttle just goes back and forth with speed and alacrity, rarely jamming. Then what do? Well, now you've got cloth with a lot of potato starch chunk in it. You just wash it, and the potato starch washes out. Now, it's true, you could do this with cornstarch, but cornstarch doesn't penetrate as well. It doesn't adhere as well, and it's a devil to wash out of cloth. That's potato starch. Now, so potato farmers in Aroostook County took advantage of this opportunity in ways that were consistent with the transformation of the textile industries. Why did the textile industries go through transformation? Simple. Until the mid-1830s, almost all the cloth that was used to produce human clothing was flax, linen. Only as we got into the southern United States producing high volumes of low-cost, slave-created cotton, did the cotton industry come to the fore in a manner which enabled the production of cloth at a very low cost. And suddenly a person could actually have two sets of clothing instead of one. Timely, up until King Pulp came along, the 1880s into the 1890s, paper was made entirely from rags, linen rags. The United States of America was the world's largest importer of rags throughout the latter half of the 19th century. Why? Because it produced a lot of paper. Newspaper industry went crazy because the price of paper was continuing to escalate. The world literally went into a rag supply global crisis, and science had to be prodded to come up with finding an alternative. They used pineapple husks, seaweed, banana peels, bamboo, all sorts of things in testing, trying to make paper from other fibers. And all came a cropper. One one entrepreneur in Massachusetts lost access to rags that was so dire that he started scouring around seaports in Massachusetts and Connecticut, gobbling up canvas, old rope, sisal material, burlap bags, all kinds of fibrous material. And he made a paper that turned out to be strong, sturdy, and quite handy. And the only problem was that he couldn't get it white. It was kind of yellowish. And we know it today as manila paper. And it was yellowish because he was relying on raw material that came out of the Philippines that was used to produce the big hawsers, the big giant thick rope that shipping magnates used back in the day. Back to the starch and the pulp and the paper. Just as with cotton thread, paper when produced from pulp has these little errant fibers that peek up over the plane of the paper. And if you don't do something about that, ink just blotches and smears. So how do you cure that? And the answer is you throw a little potato starch in the slurry with the pulp. And when you do that, it has a certain amount, just the right amount of adhesive quality. And if you then take your paper out of solution and put it through a process known as calendering, which is to say you roll it through two tightly pressed together steel cylinders. If you've got just the right amount of potato starch in that, it becomes perfectly thick. Newsprint is 0.0032 inches thick. And any little deviation from that becomes a problem for the newspaper printer. But in a matter of just a couple of years, once the technology was developed, as we know, Great Northern came in, created the world's largest paper plant in Millinocket, able to do so for a particular reason. When Aroostook County tried to make a big railroad, they got a lot of pushback from railroad magnates in Canada, in Boston, and even in Augusta. They wanted no part of it. The lumber barons wanted no part of it. So they had to find a way to sort of inch forward. And they raised the money themselves, and they found a smart guy, Mr. Cram, C-R-A-M, who agreed to pioneer this self-starter undertaking. All he needed was a charter from the state, which he got, but he got it with conditionality. Bangor and Aroostook Railroad could be built, but only if they were willing to take on the burden of two bankrupt rails that the rail network in Maine had unwisely created. The Katahdin Iron Works rail and the Bangor and Piscataqua rail. So Mr. Graham said, if that's the deal, I'll take these old railroads and all the debt they owe, $200,000 worth of debt, and I'll work with it. So his decision moving forward from that was to build a railroad network into Aroostook County that met certain conditions of going from commercial center to commercial center and back. So Holton, Presque Isle, Caribou. But he wanted the rail network to also go through some virgin lands that weren't populated necessarily, and he wanted to do that because it was a venture capital undertaking. So he took one remnant of the old Katahdin Iron Works rail and threaded it through a place that would become Millinocket. And when he did so accidentally, he came within 1 mile of the optimal place for Great Northern to build their first major pulp paper factory. So as a courtesy to Great Northern, he built 1 mile of rail between the old system that had been forced upon him to the site of construction for the Great Northern Mill. And as a consequence, they had rail access to and from. They were able to build their mill in a year, and soon they were producing 275 tons of newsprint per day on that rail. That 1 mile of rail paid for everything else in the Bangor and Aroostook rail network. It was the thing that produced more revenue than the rest of that network combined. It was an accident. An accident. And so, one of the net effects of this was that through it all, these calamitous explosions of opportunity, two things are the important footnote. Farmers were very, very good at producing vast amounts of potatoes. They were very, very bad at marketing even one spud. And as a consequence, offlander outsiders came and positioned themselves as brokers between farmers of table stock and consumers of table stock. And that created great oscillations in the market. So values rose and crashed, and there was periods of time during price crashes when the starch factories came in and bottom fed, and they said, well, we know you want $5 a barrel for your potatoes, but no one's going to buy them because no one in Chicago cares about your potatoes, because by the time they get there, they're terrible. So we'll give you 30 cents on the barrel. And the reputational calamity that the starchers were willing to take on resulted in generations of resentment between potato farmers and operators of starch factories. It's still out there today. You can echoes, in any potato farmer you talk to today has very few kind words to say about starchers. The other thing is that all of this opened up Aroostook County suddenly to competing on the international and the national economic stages. And that was something they were ill prepared for. They didn't plan for success, in other words. And what happened was they couldn't compete with large volumes of potatoes coming out of Idaho. They couldn't compete with wheat coming out of the Midwest. And so over the course of time, other things affected the county. One example would be in 1914, of all things, the opening of the Panama Canal. How does the opening of the Panama Canal affect Northern Maine? And the answer is, wood products that came out of Northern Maine, bound for Baltimore, were at price point way out of the league of Western Northwest American timber and lumber coming out of Oregon and Washington and Northern California, because they could efficiently get to market through the Panama Canal, and price crashed. Maybe it's good news. Forestry changed enormously. Pulp was seen as ravenous in its consumption of wood, and the forest needed a pause, because without a considerable pause, it would have been exhausted. And the bottom falling out of the lumber market had occurred about the same time as consciousness about the power of pulp eradicating the forest, and suddenly forest management found its way into the lexicon of Northern Maine naturalists. After this, the numbers of mills opening became rare, closing more common, and by the turn of the century, year 2001, 2002, of the 350 mills that had been here, had diminished to a mere handful. And by the time I was a freshman in college at 26 years old, jogging around Fort Kent Mills, past Tardiff Mill, there was really only one left, and that's Tardiff Mill. And we'll turn to that in the next segment. previous segment, we learned that 4 major transformational events occurred heel to toe and sometimes overlapping in the early part of the 1900s that saw a boom in sawmills and a little bit of a swoon in grist mills, and that process continued throughout the remainder of the 1900s and into the 2000s. The mills that survived the longest during that period of time were sawmills, and there were sawmills that produced that milled local trees for consumption by local users, and mostly that was farmers for a long time, and it continued that way until the potato wars of the 70s and 80s, which were devastating to farmers in Aroostook County and Upper St. John Valley. They lost out to large-scale producers in the Midwest and to, frankly, predatory market practices, both by small-scale brokers, but also by large-scale producers. And in this regard, I speak specifically of J.R. Simplot, who was the king of potatoes in Idaho. He engaged not just in producing lots of potatoes and overwhelming markets with large supply at low price. He got into the shady business of fixing markets in the commodity exchanges and ended up crashing potatoes. When he did that, farmers fell out of the economy, and a lot of the local sawmills that had been producing finished product drawn from lumber coming off of farms, timber coming off of farms, and returning to those same farms in lumber, that dynamic faded, and it faded calamitously for some. To include the Tardiff Sawmill. The sawmill itself had been originally built in 1920 with the ascendance of King Pulp. The biggest employer in Fort Kent decided to just get out of the milling business entirely. They had done some gristing in grist mills and a roller mill, and they had fabricated shingles and produced lumber for the longest period of time. But the market for long lumber shingles basically dried up, and the Fort Kent Mill Company dissolved itself and became more of a real estate company than a lumber mill. But in the collapse of the Fort Kent Mill Company, which had produced product for marketing outside the area, the need for local finished product was still very real. And one of the great milling families of the St. John River Valley, the Curvos, had done grist milling for generation after generation, got into the sawmill business. Joseph Curvo in 1920 acquired some of the land that was freed up out of the inventory of land owned by the Fort Kent Mill Company. And in almost exactly the very same place where in 1827 Daniel Savage and Cotton Walker built the first mill in Fort Kent, Joseph Curvo built a mill for purposes of sawing. And he employed hydropower, probably a water turbine, and a rotary blade to produce wood felled locally, turned into lumber for local consumption. After about 20 years or so, he passed that mill to his son. After another 20 years or so, his son sold it to a man who still lives with us, Adolphe Jr. Gaillon. And some years after that, he sold it to a fledgling sawmiller who, by self-admission, hardly knew what he was doing, but made a go of it. Raoul Tardiff purchased this mill in its form and with its machinery inside in 1960-ish, 58, 59, 60, somewhere in there. Ran it for 30 years, and then subsequently passed it by sale to his son, Dan Tardiff, in 1990, who operates it today. And so just as a little treat towards the end of this presentation, I thought we would walk through the mill. We've sketched up a little floor plan, and it has the essential elements of any mill. It has a deck down which rolls in logs, and an apparatus whereby the logs are moved through a saw rather than the saw necessarily through the log. And it produces waste material and salvageable material. And all of the notionally waste material is salvaged. Sawdust, saw shavings, slabs of wood with a lot of bark on it, either becomes material for biofuels or bedding for animals or future firewood, you name it. Everything is salvaged, everything is saved, everything is sold. In the process of doing this on an annual basis, Dan goes through about 700,000 board feet of wood, about 1,400 cords. Most of it comes today from local logging contractors who know what he needs, know what he has interest in, and they market it to him. In the winter, typically the mill closes, too cold to operate, but we find that in that part of the season, ground freezes hard and swampy areas become frozen, and heavy equipment can get into places where cedar is available, still some. And Dan will, during the winter himself, go out in the woods and makes it sound so easy. He used to go out in the woods and cut down some trees. But it's far more tedious and difficult than merely that. But he'll go out and he will fell and harvest wood for use in his own mill. About 40% of what he mills is consumed locally. The remainder is sold to concerns downstate who are interested in cedar housing or cedar fencing. About half of what he saws is cedar. Of the other half, about 1/3 each is spruce or fir or tamarack. I have an acquaintance who's a general contractor, builder, makes high-end homes, always interested in specialty woods. I told him this March that I had seen on Dan Tardiff's property a freshly milled 20-foot 8x8 beam of tamarack, weighed about 300 pounds. And the contractor says, I know, what's tamarack? And I explained it to him, and he was excited. And he said, where can I get that? And I said, well, you get on I-95, you go north till it ends, you take a left on Route 1, and you go to the next to the last stoplight, take a left, go down the river about 1.5 miles, and there's a fork in the road on the right. You go there. Otherwise, you're not going to get it anywhere. The point being, in my snarky little way, this mill and others still operating in this valley, some of which escaped the attention of Mr. Terrio's inventory, have a very substantially successful working model. That working model is local wood, milled locally, custom. Whether that custom means for home project developers or people who want to make fine furniture or whatever it may be. It's all local and custom. You can't get a 20-foot piece of tamarack in an 8x8 beam anywhere, much less by going all the way north on I-95. So custom work, local consumption, and the connection of that felled wood emerging as physical property is proof that the community's motto is true. The ethos of this community, all up and down this valley, is attachment to the natural land. And how do you prove it? You use what you got to build what you get. And that's what these mills are the agency for. So let's take a walk through this one heritage enterprise and work our way through it in the same way the log would go. from the marshalling yard all the way out the indoor to the loading platform for delivery to customers. So in the fall of October 2022, Robert Nolesnik, the IT director at UMFK, agreed quite amiably to use his drone to do some flyovers of the mill. And here you see the mill basically from the bird's eye view. Off to the left, there are this little pyramid of sawdust that's salvaged and used, as mentioned earlier, for purposes of animal bedding throughout the community. Otherwise, heavy equipment, stockpiles of wood, goes in one end, and then by the time it emerges, it's no longer a log, it's finished product. In the winter, the mill goes quiet, it closes. Does so especially when the ground is frozen and access to cedar improves. And in those times during the winter, Dan Tardiff works harvesting cedar stumpage deep in the North Maine woods. The logs accumulate throughout the winter, and then around April or May, the mill opens again and campaigns of milling begin. And the first step of that, of course, is to use heavy equipment, front-end loaders and whatnot, to move logs from the stockpile area onto what they call the deck. So the log deck is just a pile of wood that's ready to roll effectively into position for milling. That process moves the logs individually to be positioned aboard a thing called a carriage. That carriage will serve to move the log along a track in a manner that accommodates the log up to 24 feet long. Very rare. You can't get that, in a large-scale factory in Ashland or elsewhere that produces all 2x4, 8-foot 2x4s. You can't get a 24-foot stick of wood to produce a product. Anyway. The carriage itself is more modern than when it was first installed in the 1920s by Mr. Kuriwo. Today it has electronically operated dogs that hold the log in place and tapers that position the log to overhang the edge of the carriage on the blade side. In doing that, the log is just off the carriage enough to result in passing through the blade and creating a slab that is a plank of wood. Once it's seated on the carriage, it's positioned there by the worker called the loader. Here he has a white hat on. The sawyer, Dan, in this instance, is wearing an orange hat, and he assumes total control to position the log in the true perpendicular alignment with the cutting plane of the saw. The sawyer then passes the log-loaded carriage forward electronically, cable-driven, into the turning blade. Safety on the blade floor at all times is the responsibility of the sawyer. The blade itself is kind of a majestic thing to see, and it's frightening when it, at least to me, to naive people, when it's moving. It's got 36 carbide-tipped teeth, and it's powered by a 100 horsepower electric motor. The teeth have to be sharpened once a day, and it's a process. The sharpening process takes about 5 minutes, according to Dan. He uses a specialty tool that's battery powered, fixes it right up. Slabs fall from the carriage as it moves forward beyond the blade to a drop point. That's beyond the conveyor. Here, the first cut has yielded a non-lumber trim piece. It's just a hunk of bark, basically, not too thick. The operator moves that down along the conveyor, and part of the slab will be salvaged for firewood, and the remainder would be collected for sale to clients who use it to produce biofuels. cut a slab of bark off, retract the carriage and the carriage-mounted log, and use the power of the tapers to push the exposed face of the log anew out over the edge of the carriage. And these are formed each time the lawyer advances the carriage through the blade. He retracts it, adjusts the position, and then the logs overhang to produce the next slab that falls off in the next pass. Once usable planks, slabs, are cut off the log, each plank has to be trimmed. So you can imagine now that the upper side and the lower side of the board has bark on it, and must be then loaded onto a conveyor system and pushed through what they call the edger. The edger trims simultaneously both sides of the board so that you end up with excuse me, now a rough cut piece of dimensional lumber. So it's rough on four sides, but it looks like a board, acts like a board, looks like a board. It's a board. Not all, but some of those boards, if they meet quality criteria and have, for example, an established customer who's ready for 32 pieces of 1x4 tamarack, that lumber is salvaged and placed in another part of the mill ready to be planed, which is to say it will be trimmed on all four sides in a simultaneous pass through the planer. In this image we see one of the laborers moving wood into a point of accumulation in the planer room. So they don't plane every day, but they accumulate stockage, and when they have enough to satisfy the good purpose of using the planer, then they go into a planing campaign. In that, they use a roller system similar to the edger, mounting the accumulated wood plank by plank, one by one, on the conveyor system. And this is a set of rollers, and they roll a plank down to an operator. In this case, we see Dan Tardiff, again with his orange hat on, signaling he's in control of the operational floor. He'll take wood one at a time, stick at a time, and pass it through this planing mechanism. Of course, he sets it for the criteria of what he wants it to come out. What he wants to come out is a 2x6 or a 1x4, 3x6, 4x4, whatever it may be. He controls the dimensionality of the planer as the operator, and then passes the stick of wood through the machinery. Once it passes through, he's been quite clever at how he's designed his floor plan. The output into the planer is up against a wall, which has a door. What a good idea. So as the product emerges off the output side of the planer, he has a crew in the yard who takes it one stick at a time and sorts it according to species, length, dimensionality. And at the end of that planing campaign, then they've got ample wood that they will then further sort, stack, and prepare either for local consumption or, quite often nowadays, transport to a final downstate consumer. And this is what it looks like when it's staged up. Most men I know, and a lot of women I know, are almost natively attracted to the beauty of a piece of wood, especially one that's freshly cut. And there's a sentimental ballast coefficient to that attraction when you see wood accumulated in the way just described, wood that came from 3 miles away on a farmer's woodlot, rendered to become product that will be part of a building that will stand the test of time. That, of course, leads us to what happens to this stuff. And it borders on the spacey, if not philosophical. But this stuff returns to the land. And we've got a few examples of this model. In one instance, we had an introduction to Darrell Bossy. He's the son of a now deceased, locally well-known potato seed farmer, Orny Bossy. When he was a young man, Darrell took it upon himself, with his father's urging, to fell a large number of tamarack trees from their family farm, cart them to Tardiff Sawmill, and have them milled into lumber product. They then took that lumber product back to their farm, and Darrell stands proudly here inside a potato barn, one of two he made for his dad, an enormous scale, quite wide, maybe 12 feet wide, 12, 14 feet high, all tamarack, every bit of it. Tamarack is a special wood, very long lasting in the plank. And as Darrell proudly says, these barns are going to last for 200 years, and I'm pretty sure they will. He also, at the behest of his father, made a home for his mother, which is out near where their farm is on Fox Road in the Fort Kent area. Seen here, built in the 70s. Looks like it was made yesterday. Again, largely tamarack installed, but every bit of it, in terms of the wood product, from their own farm, milled by the Tardiff Sawmill. Another pillar of the community is Joe Bouchard, 6th generation, 5th generation family farmer, owner-operator now of Bouchard Family Farms. He recently wanted to get a little bit more into cattle and commissioned Tardiff to produce a whole series of upright beams, 8 by 8 in size, 20 feet high. Impossible to get anywhere other than here. Impossible to get anywhere other than here at Tardiff, really, in effect, because of the scale and the nature of the wood that Joe wanted. Joe built his fine-looking cattle barn using all wood milled from Tardiff, the only exception being, truth in advertising, the rafters, which he had engineered off-site. Couldn't remember from where, maybe some Amish guys down around Presque Isle. Joe's also kind of noteworthy to point out, because not only does he run a farm, but he produces buckwheat flour. Buckwheat he grows, and flour he mills in his own buckwheat mill in Fort Kent. So, you know, what goes around comes around. The only buckwheat mill I know of left in Aroostook County is Joe's here in Fort Kent. Another gentleman in the area who was enormously kind to me when I started this, and tolerant of my naivete, is Larry Guimont. Larry Guimont stands here with his little sleeveless work vest, looking like a regular old guy, because he is a regular old guy. But he's a very uncommon man. He started logging in the woods probably out of high school, probably about the time I came here in the mid-70s. He started with 2 horses and a chainsaw. And now he owns 1,000 acres of woodland. He's got a great house, nice wife, good kids. At one point a few years ago, he felled a number of trees on his farm, took the logs to Tardiff. Tardiff milled it. Ironically, he took the lumber back to his home, and he built a fine-looking workshop shed. It's quite big, about the size of my house. And I say this is ironic because he purposes the building as a place where he houses now his own portable bandsaw mill. And now he does his own lumber. But he does his own lumber. It's a small sentence, but it means everything about the combination of this product. He fells his trees and he makes lumber, and he produces a structure on his property that will stand for generations. And again, this is reflection of cohesion. The community believes in its own ethos that it's attached to the land. How do you better demonstrate that than this kind of fact on the ground? Now, much as I've fallen in love with Tardiff Sawmill, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the only one in this community that works on this model. Here's another, the Voisine Cedar Mill in Frenchville. The mill itself is a bit of a story. The machinery inside was salvaged from a place we're told was Desjardins Mill in Wallagrass. Reno Voisine, then a lumberjack, felled tamarack trees, brought them to the Desjardins Mill in Wallagrass, and rendered them to lumber. Carted them up to Frenchville, built this highly functional, straightforward mill, and then went back to Wallagrass and loaded up the millworks, the saw, the planer, the edger, and the rest. Drove them up to his mill and installed them. He did that 28 years ago, and he never looked back. He's been sawing cedar, tamarack, and the like ever since. In recent years, to prove not only that this is cohesion in one extreme, but intergenerational, he took on, the mentor Reno Voisine took on a protege, a young guy who knocked on his door, and Sam Bolio by name. And so the mentor now has a protege. And I'll leave this entire thing wrapped up in a sentence that Reno said to Sam when Sam came and knocked on the door and asked for a job. Sam said, "You have any work that I can do?" And Reno said, "Well, there's good news and bad news." "Yeah, I got work you can do." That's the good news. The bad news is it involves work, and a lot of it. And so it's so true. If you're going to be talking about attachment to the land, you better be ready to bend your back and sharpen your axe. Thank you. Should you come down to the university to walk through the exhibit space, you'll find that it's really distributed into two principal venues. The first, the one that you see here, is the exhibit space within the library proper. But we've taken to install other parts of the project in the Acadian archives. It's a good way to use space, number one, but the pieces we've installed there are more thematically arranged rather than being germane to the historical arc of this essay. And so those pieces involve a discussion of grist mills, how they're made, and the manner in which they're made, sawmills and their idiosyncratic form of them from back in the early 19th century and well into the early part of the 20th. And then a final discussion that's sort of a series of maps that goes through the making of and remaking of mills in the Fort Kent Mills area as a study in the very place where the Tardiff Mill itself stands today. So we'll transition to that in the series of slides that you next see. Site selection for a water-powered mill, whether it be grist or saw, has a bit of a science to it in that you're looking for a place where you can construct a dam of the shortest possible length and the lowest possible profile for the purpose of maximizing the water it will hold as the reservoir that will power your mill. So in the case of, for example, Fort Kent Mills, the ideal place was found by Mr. Savage and Mr. Walker in the early 1820s as the place in the river where it paralleled a dominant ridge to its west and was pinched by an east-west trending ridge on the east side, creating essentially a narrows. What that meant was they could dam the river and make a short run of the river from bank to bank, the dam would run a short distance from bank to bank. It would not have to be overly high because the area upstream of where the dam was broad and flat, and hence could hold a great deal of water in the mill pond. And that was the ideal location, again, for capturing the value of water energy. And for a long time, I had assumed, wrongly it turns out, that the force of the river rushing through the mill wheel was the thing that created the energy, and that's not the case. The thing that creates the energy captured by the mill is water falling into buckets that gravity then acts on and turns the wheel. So it's gravitational force that makes a mill work, not the force of a river. So the river can be relatively quiescent. What you need is a good head of water in the reservoir behind the dam. And that's what they found at Fort Kent Mills. In any event, men wiser than me, more intrepid than most, built mills principally for the purpose of grinding grain in the early settling and pioneering of the upper St. John River Valley. These are typically Frenchmen, we've now learned. They built mills specifically for grinding grain using very heavy millstones. So the nature of a grindstone operation is that there are stones come in pairs. One, called the bedstone, is stationary. It's supported on a lattice work of purpose-built beams, specifically to host the heavy weight of these massive stones. The bedstone doesn't move and can be fixed on the lattice work of beams called the husk in a way that's very close to precisely level, using shims and the like. So they shim this piece. So that stationary stone is grooved on its face in patterns, sometimes geometric, crossing lines, sometimes in a spiral, kind of like what they call sickle, like the shape of a sickle, just a series of arcs. That stone is convex, meaning that it has a little dome effect to it. The operating part of the pair is called the runner stone, and its face, where it meets the bedstone, is concave, slightly. It's also milled in a way that makes it possible for it to turn grain into flour. So what happens is the miller sets up his apparatus and builds a building around the mill. So now he's got two foundations, One foundation for the husk, which stands independent of the foundation of the building itself. Then the building around it on its own foundation. So the rumbling of the gristing process does not shake, rattle, and roll the whole building. It only has vibration on the husk itself, and the remainder of the building remains stable. They establish the waterworks in the right place to capture gravity in water coming out of the mill pond. The wheel turns 10 revolutions per minute or so, creating force that revolves the runner stone about 80 to 100 revolutions per minute. It spins fast, a big heavy 2,000-pound hunk of rock. Coming up through the middle of both of these stones is a center spindle. So the revolving stone, the upper one, is rotating on the center of that spindle. And there's a little space between the spindle and a hopper above where the grain is stored. So the grain spills relatively slow rate out of the hopper along that spindle axis and into a space between the stones. The stones do not touch. They come very close to touching, but they do not touch. In fact, they come so close that it's closer than the size of the grain that they're gristing. Take the seed berry of wheat, right? So you got a seed berry inside a husk. That fits not quite perfectly between the stones. The stones are a little bit closer together than that. So what happens is the grain feeds in through the hopper, seizes into the space between the stones, one floating above the other, and these little cracked seams that have been chiseled into the stone begin to fill up with grain. Once they're topped off, the poor next piece of grain comes in and gets squeezed between the stones, decapitated as it were, and it cracks off the husk. And what happens next is that the residual material gets ground ever more and more and more by floating into these filler joints and rising to the top and getting whacked off. Now, with high quality stones, the bran that comes off that seed is not pulverized. It's just sheared off, cut, clean, and eventually proceeds with the flour out to the edge of the stone, where in due course the flour accumulates and then gets shunted off for winnowing later. High quality stones, the bran is easily winnowed away from the flour, and the resultant flour is very white. It's important. A rustic flour for a long time was noted in Bangor as being the best flour because it was white. And it was white because they had high quality stones. They had high quality stones because why? They come from France. And the French guildsmen who left France, arrived in Acadia, or arrived in Quebec, who eventually came to this valley, came with pride and expertise in their workmanship, and they had the best stones. I'm surmising they had the best stones. They came from where the stones came from. In any event, the Anglos, who eventually later on also produced grist mills, used locally quarried stone, granite, in the case of one still extant in the garden of a Fort Kent resident just up the hill from where the Fort Kent Mill Company was. It's granite, geometrically chiseled, and rough stone. So what would have happened in that stone was when the gristing process proceeded, that bran wasn't just sheared off and exuded intact, it was ground to dust. When it was ground to dust, it became amalgamated with the flour. And so now the flour is impregnated with pulverized bran, and when they winnow it, they can't winnow out all the bran. It ends up being brownish. So the brownish flour was less popular. In the 1820s and 1830s, there were a number of famine periods in Upper St. John River Valley brought about by harsh climate on the one hand. Now, some grain production, cultivation succeeded because it succeeded in small plots and these microclimes along the river, which the Acadians learned to do from who? The Maliseets. And so they could grow some, but they couldn't grow enough to sustain a population. And by the time 1835 rolled around, there had been 8 or so mills created in the valley, and 4 of them went bankrupt. They went bankrupt because there was no grain. One of the responses to this was a number of at least 2 major food relief convoys that came up to the upper St. John Valley to bring grain and flour out of Fredericton to feed people who were quite literally starving and freezing to death because of the climate impact of these events. In wheat was a poor choice of a crop in this part of the world. The climate was bad, the midges were bad, blight was bad, everything was bad. And so they adapted, and in the course of the adaptation, they seized upon locally acclimatized buckwheat. Now, buckwheat was sometimes referred to as Indian wheat. Buckwheat is not a grain, it's an herb. As such, it's different, but not so different that it can't be used. So rustic farmers, Acadian farmers, even some of the Anglo farmers took to growing buckwheat on a commercial scale. It was hardy, it's functional, and did everything it needed. And it was in many ways not greatly unlike, had the versatility of corn as was used in the Midwest and the South. By that I mean, not that it was on a cob, but that it was appropriately, it was sufficiently nourishing for people, but also for animals, so they could use it to amalgamate food for oxen, or for sheep, or for chickens, or for other. So it was highly versatile. What it did not have was gluten, which today may make it popular, but back then made it difficult alone to make bread. But there were grains, glutenated grains, barley, rye, which farmers could grow despite the harshness of the climate. And so it became not uncommon in the cuisine of the valley for bread to be produced with a bulk quantity of buckwheat, amended with rye flour, barley flour, and sometimes even flour made from desiccated peas, which might have been a unique taste treat. Had to have been. So that's the story of grist mills. Welcome to the sawmills section of the Mills of the Valley video project. For a variety of technical and administrative reasons, we've set this up differently than the other segments you've seen. In this instance, I'm in my home in Raleigh, North Carolina. Don Raymond is carefully ensconced in the palatial studios of WFKT TV in beautiful downtown Fort Kent. And together we're using the miracle of modern technology to record this remotely. We'll just start at the beginning. When settlers arrived in the upper St. John River Valley, they came upon vast virgin forests comprised largely of white pine and cedar that were majestic. Many of them rose to as high as 140 feet tall, 3 to 5 feet in diameter, and each of them was at least 600 years old. Settlers routinely felled these trees to clear farmland, construct homes and barns, and to export raw timber. But they had limited equipment at their disposal: felling axes, one-man crosscut saws, broad axes, and of course, strong backs with yoke of oxen. Contrary to intuition, however, the abundance of timber resources in the valley did not immediately translate into the proliferation of sawmills. With respect to timber exports, during the colonial era in Europe, lumber was largely cut by hand using pit saws. The continent was resource poor but labor rich, and by law, the British Empire stifled the building of sawmills and permitted only the importation of square timber. That was so that English laborers could be employed turning timber into lumber using pit saws. Round logs were a hazard during transatlantic voyages aboard sailing vessels because they could catastrophically shift and endanger the vessel at sea. Square timber had to be hand-hewn from round logs before shipment because using saws to form square timber made the logs too smooth, and during transit they would precisely ride against each other or flush to the ship's hull and decks. They became poorly ventilated and consequently developed black mold. Because of all these factors, beyond milling for local consumption, there was no commercial role for sawmills during the valley's early settlement. The time and cost associated with sawing lumber was a luxury settlers could ill afford. Given the harshness of the elements, their imperative was to build homes, barns, and animal shelters, and to do so quickly, if not gracefully. Structures were built using whole logs rather than lumber per se. Some, like this one in the Acadian historical village in Fredericton, were built using square timber in a manner not greatly unlike the blockhouse in Fort Kent. Others almost certainly were built using round logs in the style of hide house, shown here, which was built in upstate Vermont in 1783. The hide house is a fair example because it had to have been built with the roof pitched to withstand heavy snow, just as the Upper St. John River Valley experiences in its typical winters. As far as export timber goes, settlers and lumbermen sent square timber and later round logs downriver in log drives to Fredericton and St. John. It is worth pointing out that softwood logs, pine, spruce, and the like, can float, but hardwood is too dense. As such, although preferred for home heating, hardwoods for commercial purposes were far less desirable. After a time, birch came into commercial fashion, however, and although it did not float, it was more buoyant than most other hardwoods. As such, shippers would lash 2 spruce logs to 1 birch log, one on either side, and the spruce sufficed to overcome the birch's density and allow the 3-log mini raft to float to the sea during log drives. To facilitate log drives, boom systems were developed to help keep logs in deeper water and steer them into sorting areas. Booms were built using midstream piers spaced some distance apart in a line strung out along, but on the bias of the river's banks, like beads spaced apart on a necklace, shown here, with the upstream end landing on one shore and the downstream end ending on the opposite bank. They were linked together with a quote-unquote necklace of logs chained together to form floating barriers between each pier. To build the piers, logs were stacked into Jenga-like scaffolds that resembled massive laundry baskets turned upside down, with the open side submerged face down on the river bottom. The selectively positioned scaffolds, each one really a hollow skeleton, sometimes called a crib, were filled with boulders. They serviceably remained in place for years, generations even, despite seasonal ravages of ice flows and floods. Each crib's upstream face was tapered so that ice and other flotsam could shear off rather than collide with and damage the scaffold. A main boom was anchored ashore beyond the upstream side of the network, then connected directly to the first pier downstream of there. Similar boom segments were laced pier to pier all the way to the terminal end of the downside end of the array, whereafter again it would be anchored on the nearby bank. Intervening piers would be interconnected with boom segments. In this way, the booms between any pair of cribs could be selectively disconnected to allow boats to float across the boom line without prejudicing the containment of logs. In the end, whoever controlled the booms could dictate terms for persons or commodities transiting on the river. Indeed, the first thing that Augusta's militia did after arriving at Fort Kent in 1839 was to build booms, as shown on this vintage map. They did so even before the blockhouse was finished to intercept timber harvested on land the U.S. and England contested after the 1783 Treaty of Paris. Booms were used for decades on the Allagash, St. John, and Aroostook rivers. Indeed, they were still used after the arrival of railroads or the development of the modern road network, lasting even into the 1950s on the Aroostook River, as shown in this 1953 aerial photograph taken in the vicinity of Ashland. Moving square or round log timber by river bypassed commercial sawmills that otherwise might have been constructed in the upper St. John River Valley. Old money controlled by lumber barons, long established in Bangor, built mills in Fredericton instead. Individual enterprises came together to collectively conduct seasonal high water log drives. Each of these mass movements could have become a hopeless, entangled mess. Communally driving logs downriver, however, was possible because each lumbering enterprise, quote unquote, branded their logs using what came to be called log marks, proprietary icons as good as signatures that proved who cut and owned what logs, as shown here on this image. Log marks made it possible to track who owned what at sorting booms established at key points along the river's course. Sometimes unmarked logs entered the system, and they were separately tallied and then shared among drive partners in proportion to the number of logs they certifiably entered into the drive. River bends, as well as rapids and other low water areas, were manageable problems on the drives, but the cascade at Grand Falls was the premier physical obstacle to moving products to or from market. When too many logs arrived at Grand Falls at the same time, they could overwhelm containment booms like an out-of-control cattle stampede. If logs massed out of control upstream of Grand Falls, once they cleared the fall's crestline, they could form spectacular log jams at the foot of the fall's rock face, as shown in this image that depicts the consequence of too many logs meeting not enough river. One of the larger boom sorting arrays on the St. John River was installed downstream of Grand Falls. Shown in this sketch, you can see that log drivers cleared and sorted timber in 5 separate stages in this complex boom just upstream of Fredericton. All that said, a few family and community-focused sawmills did emerge in the upper St. John River Valley long before commercial enterprises became viable. Beerman Thibodeau included both grist and sawyer machinery in the first ever valley mill, which he built during 1789 in Grand Isle. The first standalone lumber mill, however, was the one that Daniel Savage and Cotton Walker built for commercial purposes in the place that would become known as Fort Kent Mills. 2 standalone sawmills were also built in 1830, one each in Madawaska and Grand Sault, but they closed after the catastrophic winter of 1831. The Peter and Wilmot Company of New Brunswick commissioned Savage and Walker to build a double sawmill at the narrows of the Fish River. Double sawmill, that is one structure that hosted 2 single-blade frame saws, was a common mill form that Savage and Walker were familiar with because double sawmills proliferated on the lower Kennebec River, where both men were born and raised. You might read more about double sawmills in Paul Rivard's lucid and seminal book, Maine Sawmills, published in 1990 by the Maine State Museum. Savage and Walker built a mill in 1827, and Peter and Wilmot operated it for 1 year before going bankrupt. The company transferred ownership to Savage and Walker to settle claims for failing to make good on the construction deal's financial terms. Compared to grist mills, sawmills were relatively easy to build. Like grist mills, sawmills used water wheels to power their machines. The wheel turned 10 or so revolutions per minute, while gears, clutches and cams, and belts converted that motion into about 60 cycles per minute of a single blade reciprocal saw mounted vertically in a rigid frame. This was often called a sash saw, a muley saw, or more simply, an up-down saw. For each saw, there was a track-mounted carriage, atop of which was fixed a bed that could slide incrementally left or right of the center line of the carriage. This image helps to illustrate the process. The sawyer would place a log on the bed. To ensure that the log lay perfectly still while being sawed, it was positioned atop the bed, hard up against a wooden brace called a butt block, as illustrated here. Millers used sledgehammers to drive spikes through the butt block and into the log to immobilize it in line with the track system. Leading with the tapered end of the log, the sawyer would move the carriage bed log mashup forward into the teeth of the reciprocating up-down saw blade, advancing the contraption incrementally during each of the blade's upward strokes. Because of how the log was secured to the bed, the saw had to stop short of cutting the last 4 to 6 inches so as not to slice into the metal spikes and butt block that secured the immobilized log. As such, the sawyer stopped advancing the log before planks were sheared all the way off the mother log. The operator then retracted the carriage and repositioned the log by sliding the bed just enough off the center line of the carriage to accommodate the next saw line. The sawyer cut the next plank, once again taking care not to cut through the whole length of the log. Each cut took about 15 minutes, and as shown here, the finished log would end up with any number of offspring planks still attached to the log's butt. After all the plank cuts were made, millers simply snapped each plank off the log, as shown here. They would dismount the butt of the now spent log, mount a new log, and repeat the operation. The tedious nature of milling lumber in the valley continued in this way through the 1870s, even though technology steadily advanced downstate and elsewhere around the country. Turns out that isolation is a two-way proposition, isn't it? Just as it was difficult to move products in and out of Northern Maine, it was equally tough to expect new ideas to find their way into the valley. During the 1850s, advances that were achieved in water power machinery included the water turbine. These machines were smaller than water wheels, but they produced much more horsepower. Additionally, they can be built into submersible housings so that once installed, they can work when ice-covered mill ponds or streams. Unlike water wheels that exploited gravity one bucket full of water at a time, turbines use water pushed through a nozzle to produce power. Water would be forced through nozzles that expelled water in a high-velocity stream aimed at blades on the turbine. The blades were curved downward, the face bent and turned so that after water hit the target blade, it slid down the blade's arc face away from the circular track of the spinning turbine, and thus returned to the river by way of an outlet on the turbine's underside. Beefed up horsepower that water turbines produced made it possible to use new kinds of saws too. These included gang saws, which cut multiple planks in a single pass, rotary saws that could cut entire planks all the way through the full length of the log, and eventually band saws that could cut thinner kerfs that minimize waste. Long used downstate, the first rotary blade used in the valley was installed by Michel Martin during 1870 in his Grand Isle mill. There were many other obstacles to the establishment of commercial sawmills in the valley. A hoped-for concentration of settlers failed to materialize in Northern Maine. Apart from mere isolation and the real hardship of weather and winter months, critical factors indeed that dampened settler interest in going north, flawed land use policy hamstrung settlement too. For example, Massachusetts laid down the township and range grid to organize and manage state lands. Boston tried to promote settlement by establishing a lottery to market townships during the early 1790s. The promotion was a complete bust. Very few lottery tickets were bought, even though promoters expected downstate Mainers to enthusiastically buy into the scheme. They did not. Instead, the plurality of lottery subscriptions went to preachers and church congregations in Massachusetts as speculative land investments. Although it's true to say a few congregations did sponsor actual settlement, such as was the case in Holton's origin story. As settler interest in the lottery fizzled, the real purpose of the scheme, to generate revenue for state coffers, festered. To address its budgetary shortfall, Boston bundled unsold townships into 3 1 million acre parcels. Of these, One Philadelphia banker, William Bingham, bought two, shown here in pink and purple. Bingham took an option on the third, the green-colored swath, but he did not buy that parcel. Bingham wanted these mega parcels for timber-bearing enterprises that excluded settlement-oriented development. Even though he did not purchase the third parcel, its contingent disposition encumbered settlement prospects. All in all, the Binghamized landscape caused administrative and legal barriers to integrate northern wilderness areas with the developed South. For all practical purposes, the Bingham parcels might as well have been an impenetrable mountain range. Uncertainty about the international boundary that contributed to the bloodless Aroostook War made it financially unwise to develop commercial mills in the valley. That changed after the 1842 Webster-Ashburton Treaty came into force and land tenure issues thus resolved. Nonetheless, for as long as transportation was effectively confined to south-flowing rivers, moving finished material from mills to markets was devilishly impractical. Small consignments could move both ways in the rivers using flat-bottomed horse-drawn boats, such as these, but these conveyances could not facilitate modest volumes of northbound goods or limited shipments of some products headed to downstream markets. In the end, the greatest obstacle of all to riverine commerce was the daunting cascade at Grand Falls. After land tenure stabilized, a few commercial mills came into being in the valley. These are largely Anglo businesses established along both sides of the St. John River and its tributaries. Two speculative businessmen from Bangor, Mr. West and Mr. Niles, bought the old Savage Mill property in the right bank of the river and built a new mill there in 1847, the valley's first post-treaty commercial sawmill. The following year, Mr. Botfish, another old towner, went into business with Major Dickey, and together they built their standalone commercial sawmill across the river from Weston Niles. Dickey bought out Botfish the following year, and soon thereafter he added gristing equipment and a sweetheart flour for land deal with the state. After a protracted series of transactions, the Dickey mill site became the location of the Fort Kent Mill Company. Established in the 1890s, the Fort Kent Mill Company became Fort Kent's largest ever industrial employer, but it dissolved in 1919. Commercial mills produced dimensional lumber and beams, as well as value-added lumber products like lath, clapboard, shingles, bobbins, PV handles, clothes hangers, and for a short time, even in Eagle Lake, bowling pins. Clapboard was a relatively unique cut of wood. Because wood warps according to the curve of the grain in lumber, the stability of a plank's future shape increases with proximity to the direct line of the tree's diameter, shown here. Wood siding needs to be stable as possible to be effective in its application. Because wood siding overlaps, it also must be thin on one edge and thicker on the other. As such, and as shown here, a log can be cut in a particularly clever way to form clapboards that take advantage of grain stability in line with the tree's radius. Emerging sawmill technology came late to the valley, once again a function of prolonged isolation, and arrived at about the same time that starch factories came into the region. Soon thereafter, transformative change reverberated in the valley and all across Aroostook County in heel-to-toe fashion. First came starch factories, and then in rapid succession, tiny rail, the table and seed stock explosions, big rail, and finally, King pulp, as discussed in other segments of this project. Even the monolithic Fort Kent Mill Company failed to compete with the economies of scale and market forces that downstate mills coped with so easily. After the 1920s, the destiny of the valley's sawmills was tied to the roller coaster well-being of potato cultivation. The wood that came to mills was used for building upscale frame houses on farms, whole towns, and Aroostook County's signature potato barns and railside storage facilities. Shortly after World War II, potato farmers swooned. Soon enough, farm structures were more commonly built using alternative materials, steel frames and aluminum siding, or even build on-site Quonset huts, for example. and thereafter large-scale commercial sawmills likewise faded from the valley's landscape. By way of an epilogue, after I had completed the project in discussions with the director of the Acadian Archives and Sophia Burden, Director of Library Services here at UMFK, I concluded that their generous offer to host this exhibition included slightly more room than I had originally anticipated. And they encouraged me to consider adding a capstone that would be kind of a flourish on the end of the main body of the project. And so I did. And that culminated, or came together in the form of a bonus chapter, if you will, that might be titled something like, "What's in a Name?" And that little piece of work involves a dozen or so maps that I arranged chronologically from 1826 all the way through 2020. And each map has a reference to the place that we now know today as Fort Kent Mills. But the references changed over time, starting with something firm and leading to more and more ambiguous renditions. And so this segment is the capstone to the project, and it's a discussion about where on earth might the place name Fort Mills have come from. The first mill to have been built on the Fish River was constructed by Daniel Savage and Cotton Walker, year unknown. They did it under contract for a company out of New Brunswick, and the terms were pretty straightforward. The sad part is that the company in New Brunswick went bankrupt, and they were unable to meet their end of the obligation for remuneration for Savage and Walker. So in exchange for monies owed for services rendered, they conveyed the mill to Savage and Walker. On July 25, 1831, John Dean and Edward Cavanaugh left the confluence of the St. Francis and St. John rivers, proceeding downstream towards the mouth of the Aroostook River to survey land tenure on both sides of the St. John. At day's end, they went ashore at the mouth of the Fish River, landing on the downstream side of the confluence. From there, they walked 2.5 miles upstream on the Fish Bank's right bank to meet Daniel Savage and have dinner with him in his framed house adjacent to his sawmill. They say in their report, quote, "Peters, Wilmot and Company of New Brunswick employed Savage and one Walker in 1826 or 27 to build a double sawmill on the lot for them, which they built. The mill and lot are now occupied by Savage." That's on pages 394 and 395. In a later part of their survey, they found on the north bank of the St. John River, quote, "a possession of Amos Maddox's, who is now resident at Savage's Mills, plural, on the Fish River," page 396. They mention the Savage enterprise again in greater but contradictory detail. Quote, "Nathaniel Bartlett has a deed from Savage for 1/2 of the double sawmill on Fish River, dated October 16, 1828, not acknowledged, as the deed describes it of all Savage's right and title. Bartlett supposes that Cotton Walker has the deed of the other half. The mill, singular, was built in 1825 or 26 under a contract between William Peters and Company and Walker and Savage. Peters and Company were to pay Walker and Savage £700 for building the mill, and during the building paid them £150 and occupied the mills for 1 year, but failing to pay the balance and failing in their businesses, conveyed by writing their interest in the mill, singular, to secure Walker and Savage on condition that Walker and Savage
were to deliver up the notes, which they held against them, and repay the 150 pounds. The mill, singular, has ever since been occupied by Savage and Bartlett, to whom Savage conveyed his rights as aforesaid. Page 397.
So I found an 1826 military road survey conducted at the time by agents of the state of Massachusetts, and trying to get a handle on what it was like in the upper reaches of what became known as Aroostook County. And they surveyed the strike of a road that would have emanated out of Ashland and became an early version of the military road that terminated in the area of Fort Kent that we now know to be where the blockhouse is. In the course of that survey, technically gifted, capable professional surveyors mapped out the route. And when they came up over the terrain that is now well known to Fort Kenters, the approach to Fort Kent on Route 11 as it descends into town, those surveyors with great ease could have looked down into the east and seen Savage Mill if it had been there. If they had seen it, they would have mapped it. They did not map it. And this is the summer of 1826. As a consequence, in the absence of having mapped it, I feel comfortable proposing that the mill was not there in the summer of 1826, would not have been built through the course of that fall or winter, but only would have been built in the after the following spring, and the spring floods had flushed through the river system. So the earliest it could have been built would have been 1827. So I felt confident in that. The next map I could find was published in 1835. It was done by George Coffin, who is the land agent for Massachusetts, which still had equity holding in the state and public lands of what became Maine in 1820. And on that map, Mr. Coffin depicts with a little hash mark across the river in the Fort Kent area a feature that he labels sawmills, plural. This leads me to believe that Mr. Coffin never actually went to that mill site, for if he had, he would have seen one structure and one mill. But he called it mills, so I suspected he got his reference to the plural nature of mills by reading the report that had been written a few years and published a few years earlier by Dean and Kavanaugh, their report of the survey of the St. John River Valley. Then in 1839, as the contestations between timberjackers coming out of New Brunswick and resident rustic lumber interests became more and more flush with friction, Augusta sent a military survey up north to map a prospective military road up to and including what is now Fort Kent. So they produced a military road survey of 1839, and they went and they saw that mill, and they saw the dam, because they didn't rely on the previous work. They saw what they saw, they drew a picture of a dam, and they labeled it mill, singular. That's 1839. It gets confusing thereafter, however. In 1842, as the friction between London and Quebec on the one side and Augusta and Washington on the other seized on where the infernal international boundary should be in any event, the governor commissioned John Dean of the Dean and Kavanaugh survey to do a position paper on the validity or criticism of the London claim. He tore apart the London claim with astounding detail and a narrative that's very well worth reading. But he included a map. So in 1842, Dean mapped his interpretation of where the boundary was according to the American claim. And he labeled a feature in the area of Fort Kent, and he called it mills, plural. Thank you, Mr. Dean. That clarified nothing. But a year later, William Parrott, acting on behalf of Maine and Massachusetts, also came north and also surveyed the undivided lands that included the area from about contemporary St. Francis all the way down to Grand Falls. And he took it upon himself to identify and geographically map mills as he encountered them all along the course of the Upper St. John River Valley. And what he labeled in what we now know to be Fort Kent was that in that place on the Fish River there was a mill in 1843. Yay. In 1844, to settle competing claims for the same pieces of land on either side of the border, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty called for a boundary commission to survey those lands. And they produced, at least on the American side, a phenomenal set of maps all the way from essentially Allagash down to the Grand Falls. And they're all drawn at the same scale, and they depicted every plot of land and every granted and deeded land along the river. If one were, intrepid today, they could take those maps and enlarge them and mosaic them into what I would say would be a stunningly beautiful depiction of land ownership along the entire river. But in any event, the aesthetics of it all aside, in 1844, the Webster-Ashburton Boundary Commission mapped Fort Kent, drew a dam, and right next to it appended the label Sawmill, singular, 1844. 1849, as land tenure became more stable and people were more committed to precision in the ownership of their properties, more maps were made, basically overlaid to the 1844 commissioner maps with updates, annotations. That's what we'd expect. This is a natural course of events. But in 1849, the override to the 1844 map in Fort Kent clearly drew a dam, and right next to it labeled mills, plural. Now, this is possibly correct in that in 1849, the mill that had been the Savage Mill, now the Weston Isles Mill, was in place on the east bank of the river at the Narrows and functioning as a mill. And directly across the stream on the west bank was a parcel of land that Major Dickey had purchased for the purpose of constructing a mill, which he did, and which contained a milling operation for grain. He made a sweetheart deal with the state. In the event, that 1849 overstrike of the 1844 map depicts the feature there as mills, plural. So it was a mess. Was it mill or mills? Was it or wasn't it? Was it one? Was it two? Was it one mill with two saws inside? Hard to say. What we do know is that the place would be called in the late 1840s and early 1850s. The place would be called Fish River Mills, not Fort Kent Mills. Fish River Mills. We know this from the findings of the legislature that made the sweetheart deal with Dickey, basically, which said, you build a mill within a certain time period at Fish River Mills, and it contains grindstones for the production of flour, we'll give you, two 1,000-acre parcels of land. And they did, because he built a mill at Fish River Mills. Not long thereafter, 50 years later, during which time, only for 1 or 2 years did more than one mill operate there. 1868, the mill on the eastern bank was consumed by fire, never to be rebuilt. The one on the west bank was by then owned by Levi Sears. He bought out Dickey, and he operated that mill until the 1890s. So he died in 1883. And his widow and sons operated that mill into the 1890s, when they sold it to the Bradburys. But the point would be that between 1848 and 1868, only for a few years, intermittently during that score years, did more than one mill operate at Fish River Mills. We know after 1890, not long after 1890, now 50 years since there's only been one mill in place, what's created on the eastern shore, very near to the now defunct mill site, where Weston Niles had their mill and eventually sold it out, only to have it owned by George Seeley and burned down in 1868. In 1906, the United States Post Office is created on that spot, and it is called Fort Kent Mills, plural, Fort Kent Mills. Where did that come from? There's no way to know, really, I don't suppose, lost now to living memory. But I can say this. In 1856, when there was one mill operating on either bank at the Narrows, now known as Fort Kent Mills, a famous map-making company, Pincus and Friall, published a map of railroad networks in the northeastern part of the United States. The same company had produced railroad network maps for all over the country, from the Midwest to the Southeast, from Santa Fe all the way up to and including the rails that were in southeastern Maine at the time. And they cartographically did something that others before them had done, and they labeled the feature at the Narrows as mills. Straight up, just mills. But the funny cartographic accident in that piece was that the word mills was illuminated on the map just beneath the place name for the town that was just north of there, Fort Kent. And so if you were to read the map quickly, you would look at this as a solitary place called Fort Kent Mills. Is that the genesis? I leave it to others to determine, but I can find no other better explanation. As an end point to this, I've included gratuitously, because as the author I can, a contemporary Google map image of Fort Kent Mills, to include on it an overlay of where the Fort Kent Mill Company was, where the dam was, where the bridge was, certainly the Dickey Bridge, and all of that proximal to where today's Tardiff Mill is. It's a sweet little snapshot of one place, which is the final punctuation mark to 240 years of milling in the Upper St. John River Valley.